Welcome to this second day of SGP 2024. So it's my great pleasure this morning to introduce our keynote, Alec Jacobson. So Alec is an associate professor at the University of Toronto and a senior research scientist at Adobe Research. He received the ACM SIGGRAPH Significant New Researcher Award and the Sloan Research Fellowship for his contributions in geometry processing in particular. And today he'll give us a fresh look at our good old friend, the triangle. So please welcome Alec.
Thank you, Sylvain and Ray Jen for inviting me, and thank you, Justin and Mina, for hosting me. SGP is my academic home. It's a really special honor to be delivering a keynote here. I found an old photograph, not necessarily the most embarrassing one, but I was still kind of embarrassed to see it. SGP was my first academic talk ever. I was incredibly nervous, and I remember exactly who was really mean to me in the Q&A session. SGP is also the place where we can geek out about triangle meshes, and it's a place where we can go into really intricate detail about the meshes that we study. And I know this very well because I'll be giving a paper talk later where I really geek out on meshes and try to present something new about meshes. I work with triangles a lot. I developed the libIGL library now for over 10 years, I think close to 15 years. This is a C++ library for processing primarily triangle meshes. I could spend hours working with triangle meshes. One time I was sitting at a coffee shop and I was toiling away at my program, and I tend to sigh a lot when I'm debugging, and I'm just like, ugh. And finally everything was working and I saw what I needed to see on the screen, and I was so relieved. I was like, yes. And the guy next to me at the coffee shop was like, all of that for an elephant. Today is a really wonderful time to be doing geometry processing research because the stakes are really high. Geometry and geometric data is really everywhere in our lives now. So our children are playing Roblox. So many children are playing Roblox, but this is also a place that's turning into some form of this metaverse, or a place where we're moving parts of our lives, whether we want to or not. Children are making and selling games on Roblox. Companies like Walmart and IKEA are creating something in there that they need IKEA employees inside of Roblox working there. 3D printing has gone so far since a decade ago. You can buy a 3D printer this afternoon for $69. That's amazing. There are companies like Topology which are getting massive investments to change the way that we do advanced manufacturing. 3D printing is, of course, also changing our society and the laws that we have in our society. Geometry changes the way that we communicate with each other, whether it's explaining COVID to each other, or whether it's the New York Times explaining the latest disaster through one of their wonderful scrollers where they use geometry to tell a story, or independent investigators questioning the authority of governments. When we look at the new advances in 3D geometry, we're not seeing a lot of triangle meshes in the splashy, exciting results. In fact, the New York Times has switched their 3D portraiture to NeRF capture because they like the way that it captures appearance and reflections. Last year, there was released a commercial by McDonald's that used NeRFs in a creative way to tell this advertisement story. And if anyone hasn't tried the browser version of the Gaussian splats demo, I really encourage you to try that today. That is super impressive. You can zoom in on this bicycle and see individual spokes. And it's not just reconstruction where we're seeing these new representations making a big impact. We're also seeing it take the place of triangle meshes for new types of 3D modeling. So these are examples of papers in the last couple of years that are doing some form of text to 3D. And these are also really impressive. This demo is online. It gives the false impression that it's instantaneous, but you can still do choose your own adventure text to 3D, and it is quite remarkable how well it captures it. And it's out of date. Like, I think the methods that are available now are superior to this. So as triangle mesh researchers, we may feel lost and kind of obsolete. What is our role now? Should we give up with triangle meshes and just rebuild our pipelines on whatever new representation is there? Just same old pipeline, just do this for NERF, so we can generate a lot of geometry processing with deep sign distance fields, or geometry processing with neural radiance fields, or geometry processing with Gaussian splats. Another alternative is to double down hard on like one representation is the true representation, and we should do everything with that representation. We should declare a representation war and insist that this one representation is the singularly best representation. And I think we see this sometimes in explanations of new advances where we say like, well, we can't do this and this and this with this representation, so therefore point clouds are the best, or therefore triangle meshes are the best. So my point today is that we should choose not to see new representations as a problem. We should embrace the diversity of different function spaces. And this will hopefully give us the freedom to care more about what comes before our pipelines and what comes after our pipelines. And one of the things I'm really excited that our community shifts more toward working on is tracking error and uncertainty through our pipelines. And I'm going to talk today about how we have some evidence that we're already doing these things and we're good at it, and I think we'll be very good at doing this in the future. When I was making this talk, I realized that the things that I wanted to say don't really follow a tour of my previous publications, so I'm sorry this won't be like a collection of papers that I've written in the last few years. It'll be talking a lot also about other people's work, but I will try to highlight some of my students' work along the way if it makes sense. Neural fields have completely exploded in the last few years. This is a bar chart from a publication, a survey of neural field research. And two things that I'd like to point out here. This is a survey from 2021. This has only increased. So this is skyrocketing even more. And if you look over at the absolute values on the y-axis, be careful to realize that these are broken down by halves, so that it's twice this much every year. One thing that I've been bugging my students about for the last couple years is thinking about this question like, okay, we're doing this research on triangle meshes right now. Like, are we going to be using triangle meshes in 5 years? Most of them are like, okay, yeah, sure, of course we're going to be using triangle meshes in 5 years. How about 50 years? How about 100 years? In the year 2122, will we still be using triangle meshes? And right now you're thinking like, this guy can't do math. That's not 100 years from now. I chose that number specifically because that is the year that the movie Alien takes place.
Roll 92 degrees, port yaw.
Prime the port.
And okay, maybe this is more indicative of the year Alien was made in 1979. This was actually one of the first uses of computer graphics in a major motion picture. And one of the people that was involved in creating this computer graphics, Brian Wyville, gave a keynote in 2011 entitled "Announcing the Sad Death of the Triangle Mesh." And Christopher Batty wrote to me a couple weeks ago and told me that he was made aware of that title when he gave a keynote talk called "The Triangle Mesh Strikes Back." So if anybody is like really upset about my talk today, maybe in a couple years you can give a counter keynote and say it strikes back again. So okay, I've been saying stuff about triangle meshes and whether we're going to keep using these. So what's really the alternative? What are we talking about when we say we're using something other than a triangle mesh? And I think right now the dominant answer to that question is implicit functions. And the idea with an implicit function is to represent the shape as a level set that maps 3D space to a scalar number. So let's call that function f. And then we say that our surface is the set M of all the points where f evaluates to 0. This categorizes space to points that are less than 0 and points that are greater than 0, and our surface lies at the boundary between them. If we add extra information on top of, or extra constraints on the top of this function f, we can say, okay, f should also, when we're away from 0, measure the magnitude of distance to the surface. So its sign reveals inside-outside, and its value reveals distance. Or equivalently, we can say something about the Lipschitz bound, or how quickly that function grows. And this makes that implicit function f really good for all sorts of geometric queries. So here's an example of a signed distance function for this fox. One type of query that we might want to do on an implicit function is render that thing. So we want to be able to shoot rays through our pixels and see, does it hit the surface, and how far away does it hit the surface, and where on the surface does it hit? And we can use this distance property of the signed distance function to march along our ray until we find an intersection. So the way that this starts is we have some point, maybe it's our pixel in some direction that we're looking in. We evaluate our function f. That tells us the distance to the surface. So we can draw a ball around our point, and we know that our ray doesn't hit the surface inside of that ball. So then we can march to the point that intersects the ball and the ray, and we can do this again. And we might come close to the surface and then go farther away from the surface, but eventually we either hit the surface or we don't hit the surface. And if we have this SDF property of our implicit function or an equivalent Lipschitz bound, then we can do tasks like signed distance sphere marching. Neural networks enter the picture when we create something like a deep signed distance field. And the idea here is we're choosing to parameterize the function f using a neural network. So far we didn't say how we're storing that function f. Maybe it's stored as values on a grid, or maybe it's represented in some basis. For a deep signed distance field, we're going to use a neural network with many layers of linear weights and then nonlinear activation functions. Those are the phi's and a's here. So it's just a bunch of mathematics organized as a neural network. And the interesting thing about these deep signed distance fields is that we can do things like parameterize an entire space or class of shapes. So we can train the weights of one neural network that takes a query point x, y, z. So the weights are the theta here, and we have a query point in space x, y, z. And we also have a bonus input to the neural network, which is the latent code for a particular shape. So in this example, we have a latent code for this love seat type of chair, and a different latent code for this wooden chair here. And now if we train both of these things, the bold zi's and the thetas, we can freeze the thetas, and we can change the zi's to interpolate between our different shapes. So we can think of the process of training as not outputting a particular shape or a classifier or something like that. It's outputting a callable function that then we can use inside of things like sphere marching or other queries. Yeah, and of course, that callable function outputs the signed distance at that point. We can also train a specific neural network just to represent one shape. So in this case, we don't have that bold zi as part of the input. We just say the thetas that I'm training at this particular time, those correspond to a single shape. In this case, we can't do combinations easily between different shapes, but it does give us a very compact way to represent 3D shapes. From the point of view of training over an entire class of shapes, we can think of this as overfitting to one particular shape. And unlike storing a signed distance field on a grid, this neural network is able to adapt where it's spending its information on the particular data that we have. So we can think of this as kind of a self-adapting representation. It's also continuously parameterized. So to pick the values for theta, we don't have to make discrete decisions. We can just run something like gradient descent. And we have the full topological freedom of implicit functions. So here's an example of taking a high-resolution geometry in gray at the bottom left, decimating it using traditional triangle mesh decimation, storing its sign distance field on a grid, and storing the sign distance field as a neural implicit for that one particular shape. We can take the same neural network structure and train over all of the shapes in the Thingy10K data set and use this as a type of compression. One nice thing here is that the architecture or the particular choice of nonlinear functions remains fixed. So each of the shapes is just represented by a vector of these weight values. And so we can compress this quite tremendously. Neural radiance fields, or NeRFs, are probably something that you've heard about before. These are similar to deep SDF. They are also taking a query point in space and outputting something related to geometry. Typically, they're outputting not a sign distance field, but they're outputting something more like density in space, so a value between 0 and 1. And they're also outputting something representing the color or its reflectance, so that's the RGB. They take as input not just the query point, but also a viewing direction parameterized by 2 angles. And these have really changed the way that we can do 3D capture. So this is one of my students, Toaki Takakawa, and he's set up a small NeRF studio in his apartment, and he can capture something that's lying on his couch. So instead of representing geometry, geometry as a mesh plus a texture map and UV coordinates, we're representing everything in the contents of the weights of this network. And the key here is that we're training the weights of the network against photographs that we've calibrated on that shape. So the thing that we're trying to optimize when we're finding the values of theta is how well does the rendered reconstruction of this shape match the photographs that we took. So like I said before, these have been powerful representations for reconstructing and compressing shapes, but we've also seen that they're making a huge impact in generative modeling. So the high-level bird's eye view picture, without getting into too many details of how this works, is we take a really painfully trained text-to-image diffusion model, like stable diffusion, something that takes all the images that we have on the internet and boils them into a transformer, and then we can do text-to-image. We take our 3D representation, something like NeRF or deep SDF with colors, and we say that we define the rendering function as a forward process that takes us from the 3D world to the image domain. If we can measure a loss there that tells us how well did we actually match the image that we're predicting for that text, then we can take this rendering function and reverse it during backpropagation. So if we can differentiate through this process, then we can take changes in the loss function and map them back to changes in our 3D representation. And this works because we have a continuous parameterization of the space of 3D shapes. Interestingly, there are important details on how you actually set up the loss so this works and you don't get your peacock pasted 10 times around your shape, and that you actually descend in a quick manner. But one of the, maybe the most interesting aspects here is that the neural network part for the 3D representation is not really the essential ingredient. And we've seen a number of papers in the last few years that just get rid of the neural network part and use other nonlinear representations of implicit functions. So some of these are just storing basically grid values plus some nonlinear activation on the interpolation of the grid. And then, of course, Gaussian splats are a different way of representing an implicit shape where we have 3D Gaussians that are then projected as 2D Gaussians. And the key here was really defining this inverse rendering loss, so being able to differentiate through the process of going from 3D to a 2D image, and having a good continuous and nonlinear representation for that implicit function. And anyone who's actually done this knows that if you don't have good camera alignment, none of this is going to work. So that's really, really essential to getting this to work. When I see that pipeline of the arrows and the easy back propagation between the processes, it makes me feel like the triangle mesh pipeline is quite stilted and complicated. So we look at a cartoon view of photogrammetry for triangle meshes. It might start with something like taking photographs, using some process of creating point clouds or depth from those photographs, then taking the point clouds, creating an implicit function like the Poisson surface reconstruction function as an auxiliary. It's not really going to be our output, but we're going to keep that for a second. Doing marching cubes on that. That gives us a mesh, but it's probably way too high resolution and messy, so then we have to do some remeshing and decimation on that mesh. Once we have that, we need colors on it, so we need to map that to the texture domain and store our colors there. And finally, we have something that looks like a production-ready 3D asset that we could ship off to a computer game. And the promise of all this is that once we have that production-ready asset, the geometric queries that we want to do, like rendering, are incredibly fast and highly optimized in the existing software that we have. This is not easy to optimize end-to-end. We said, take all the variables in this whole process and then throw it into gradient descent. This would be really tricky. A lot of the things happening here are really discrete choices, and they're chaining together operations that don't necessarily talk well together. If our goal wasn't to create an asset for an existing 3D, existing video game, then why are we doing this way? And indeed, the legacy real-time rendering pipeline has encouraged us to think of the space that we use for representing geometry as the same space that we use for doing computation on that geometry. And so we do this process of creating this painful process of creating this triangle mesh, and then we think of that as the surface that we're going to do our geometry processing on. And not only the surface, but also parameterizing the space that we're going to do geometry processing on. And my hypothesis for this is that both rendering and geometry processing, when this pipeline was first really coming into place, were pretty slow. And they were both kind of happy having pretty coarse models. So in 2007, this is a screenshot of a news article about Halo coming out. And you can see the geometry is pretty coarse, especially compared to today's standards. One of the best-known SGP papers of that year, or perhaps ever, has models that are on the order of 1,000 triangles. Now we've both domains have really blasted past this, right? Like Nanite in the Unreal Engine is happy having meshes of 1 million or maybe even 1 billion triangles that it can process. Similarly, in research, we're very happy processing or have come up with progressive ways of processing geometry that are very high resolution. But yet I would say primarily we're thinking of these triangle meshes in terms of defining our spaces that we're doing computation on as well. And if we look at a really simple example like this triangle mesh of a cylinder, we can see that for representing the geometry, the triangle mesh has done a great job. Yeah, why not? Just have really long, skinny triangles along the side of the cylinder. That's perfect. I don't need any more triangles along the side there. But that means I can't represent interesting functions along the side of the cylinder. So if I want to represent sort of a wave equation going across the side of the cylinder, I don't have that degree of freedom if I can only represent linear functions along these big edges. And we see the exact same problem happening with Gaussian splats. If I represent the cylinder with elongated Gaussian splats, they'll do a good job representing the side by putting very skewed or stretched out Gaussians along the side. And they're encountering the exact same problems when they try to represent interesting functions on top of the Gaussian splat representation. So a typical example of this is trying to do a deformation, and we see that these long, skinny Gaussians are then sticking out because they did a good job representing the initial geometry, but not a good job representing the displacement field on top of this geometry. Intrinsic triangulation, something that came out of this community, is a wonderful example of representing interesting functions on top of an existing geometry using a distinct function space. So in the Navigating Intrinsic Triangulations paper, they showed that you can do refinement on top of these long, skinny triangles without changing the geometry. So please look closely on this image. You can see that the the triangles on the right are actually curving, in a way, along the original triangulation. They're not a remesh of that extrinsic geometry. And yet we can represent much more interesting functions on the rightmost figure. Intrinsic triangulations are also a great way to improve the robustness of our algorithms, even on meshes that are high resolution. So this was a really surprising example that showed up in an experiment in my lab. We were trying to compute heat geodesics on this surface, and we're really confused. So this function on the left is the solution to running the heat geodesics code on this surface. You can see the surface is quite smooth, and if we zoom in, it's very highly tessellated. So we're thinking, like, what is going wrong here? Like, we have plenty of degrees of freedom. But because those triangles are consistently poor aspect ratios, the numerics in this algorithm for solving the PDEs goes very poorly. If instead we run an intrinsic flipping algorithm that improves the function space of the solutions that we can represent on the surface, but without adding any additional degrees of freedom, so it really comes at almost no extra cost, we can make this algorithm work correctly and give us high quality geodesics. This intrinsic triangulation world is becoming much more complete. So we have refinement, we have flipping and remeshing operations, and we also now have simplifications. So it gives us a new way to navigate the quality performance trade-off. So if we want a solution faster, but we want to maintain as much quality as we can, we could choose to remesh the geometry itself and then run our algorithm there. We see that in the middle. But that might give us high error compared to running a simplification of functions that live on top of the surface without changing the geometry at all. So in 2122, how will we move to representing geometry and computing on that 3D data? Maybe we'll keep triangle meshes for their explicitness. Or maybe we'll move to Gaussian splats and NURFs for their fuzziness. They can represent these surfaces that aren't just clean, hard surfaces. My expectation is that we move to representations that can leverage data and leverage data in a meaningful way. And that means moving away from rule-based representations. And we've looked back to the history in computer vision. This pattern is very clear. So this is a paper from 1973 doing face detection. And they have this wonderful figure of how they're representing the key points on a face using explicit springs between the eyes and the nose and the mouth. And one way you can see this is like, okay, this is a approximation of the growth of a human face. And this seems like perhaps a good direction to go on if we could ever reach the end of that. But of course, we know now that the way that face detection works is by observing and looking at tons of faces. And maybe approximating the process of being able to recognize faces through the visual system was more promising than coming up with a structure of rules. I hope that if we move to representations that give us this freedom to distinguish between representing geometry and our computation, then we can care more about what comes before and after our geometry processing pipeline. I and others have worked on making this pipeline much more robust because we know that it's not always easy with the existing pipeline to get data all the way through. There's many sources of failure along this pipeline. One of the things that we worked on in the past was this concept of a generalized winding number, which can be seen as a subroutine in the process of simulating 3D shapes. This was its original origin. It was hard to tetrahedralize shapes so that we could run FEM simulations to deform it. We have shapes that have open boundaries and things like that. So the winding number was a way that we could define outside and inside for a messy triangle mesh, and then we could tetrahedralize it and join the rest of the pipeline. So really this was about like plugging a hole in the existing pipeline. Later we realized that this was actually a way to skip over entire portions of the pipeline. So a typical 3D printing software expects that you give it a triangle mesh, or really an STL file, as input to its slicer, so it can decide where it squirts out the plastic. So if I have scanned something and I have a point cloud, then I have to go through this process of creating a triangle mesh and then giving it to the slicer. But really, inside of that slicer, all it's doing is taking a plane and then making a decision about what the tool should be doing in its path to fill the inside of the model with material. And this is really a question of inside and outside. So if we can answer the question of inside and outside directly for the point cloud, then we can skip over the process of making this triangle mesh. And indeed, we had someone working in our collaboration at that time who was writing his own slicer, so we're able to change the slicer to take directly as input this generalized winding number function and print a point cloud directly with no triangle meshes. I've done a lot of work in the past on making geometry processing robust, and I think this is indeed really noble, and this helps us get more throughput through our geometry processing pipeline. But I also think it's not enough. I think we should question the pipeline altogether and specifically think about which parts of the pipeline are no longer needed or have become obsolete or are there just for legacy reasons. So just as the triangle meshes are themselves symptomatic of the legacy real-time rendering pipeline, so are many of the core algorithms that we work on in geometry processing research. So if we think of something like UV mapping, we typically think of this problem as picking new UV coordinates for each of the vertices of our mesh. And that's how we think of the problem of mapping a surface to the plane. And deformation, we also think of as picking new vertex positions over time for an existing triangle mesh. As a side effect, these have created the expectation that our algorithms run somewhat on the order of solving a big, sparse, linear system. And that biases the way that we view new contributions in the field of geometry processing. And I think also, as researchers, we should become comfortable with the idea of doing gradient-based optimization. And this is for a couple reasons. There's great examples of how traditional mesh processing algorithms can benefit from gradient-based optimization or things like the atom solver. So both of these papers set up a convex optimization problem that you could then feed to a black box QP solver or semi-definite programming solver, but they show that you can get tremendously better performance by running some adaptation of stochastic gradient descent or atom. And there's more and more of these showing up in our field, and I think this is really wonderful. Like, we should break out of the habit of just setting up a big system and solving it. There's also lots waiting for us at the end of, well, waiting a long time for gradient descent to converge. So we can set up much more interesting problems than convex or linear problems that we're comfortable with. And we may indeed have to wait a really long time, but that's how you get things like stable diffusion or text to 3D, or at least the initial taste of those, through waiting a long time and seeing what's at the end. And please don't get me wrong, practitioners today definitely want triangles right now. Like, they really, really don't want the pipeline to change and would be really happy if we could continue making those production-ready assets. And I think that's also worthy to continue doing. This is a really wonderful company that does capture of animals and doesn't just output like messy representations that nobody can use. They go through that whole process of remeshing and making sure that the mesh flows along the lines of action of the animal, and they even rig the animals so that they can be used in video games or in museums where children can study these animals. Ultimately, though, I think if we stick with the triangle mesh pipeline as is, it's myopic, or it's looking at short-term problems that are small and safer for us to work on. So this is an example of a YouTube video where someone is taking the output of topology optimization that works with typically some kind of implicit field over a grid, and then manually converting it back into a triangle mesh representation or actually a CAD representation, so that the rest of their pipeline can work smoothly. And it's interesting to consider, well, what happens if we change the back half of that pipeline so that that topology optimization doesn't have to be stopped and manually traced, but can even continue through whatever comes next, if it's simulation or it's verification, and then see that loss or something that we can measure there can be backpropped all the way to the topology optimization. So we're in America, and it's nearly July 4th. And I was thinking about, like, what are like maxims for research, or like how do I decide what problems to work on? And one of the things that I came up with was don't ask how fast you can eat a whole hot dog, ask how fast you can eat lots of hot dogs.
They say it's a marathon and not a sprint. But don't tell that to 23-year-old, 130-pound Takeru Kobayashi, who took a big lead. No one, not Hungry Charles or the Doginator, could catch up. The Americans just dropped their dogs in awe. The clear-cut wiener Kobayashi, who inhaled 50 hot dogs in 12 minutes, shattering the world record.
So that's actually an old video, and people eat hot dogs even faster now. But this guy, Kobayashi, he blew up the hot dog eating world. Like, I think almost twice as many hot dogs as the previous year. And he did it by changing the strategy. Most people were taking a hot dog and then trying to eat the hot dog as fast as they could. And he said, well, my goal is to eat a lot of hot dogs. I'll take the meat part out, eat that quick, then dip the bun in water and like swallow it whole like a, I don't know what. But it's just like such a wonderful, weird example of viewing the larger problem and optimizing for that, or finding a new pattern that shatters the previous way of thinking about it. Another way that I've been looking at problems is asking, am I solving a mesh problem, or am I using a mesh to solve a problem? The meshes are there for us. Like, we don't owe them anything. We don't have to solve their problems, but we can use them to solve our problems. Another one that can sometimes send me into a very philosophical state is this question of asking, are we looking for an exact solution to an approximate problem, or an approximate solution to an exact problem? And I think both of these are incredibly interesting, and I've worked on both flavors of these, and I'd like to just give a little taste of what that feels like. So solving a problem exactly can be really satisfying. And we worked on this in the past doing mesh Boolean operations. So the input is meshes that meet a specific set of criterias. And if they meet those criteria, we can give you the precise answer of what their union is or what their intersection is. And there's no arguing about whether or not we gave the right or the wrong answer based on our algorithm. We can prove that it's giving the correct algorithm. It's giving the correct result. But often what we want is not that exact result. We wanted something that would give us a better answer to the approximate problem that we've set up. So this is taking two meshes of a cube that are perfectly coplanar. They're meeting perfectly at their shared face, but then rotating them in floating point coordinates and passing them to our supposedly exact algorithm. And the green bit in the middle is their intersection. So it should be empty because they don't actually share any intersection. But we can see, depending on that rotation, we get small bits of floating point error that then manifest as an overlap between the shapes. And sure, we can be really satisfied that we solved this exactly, and maybe there's some application that like needs to determine what this intersection is. But there are lots of applications in modeling where really what we wanted was something that would fuse these together if we were doing a union operation. And that's more the exact solution to the approximate problem than the approximate solution to the exact problem. Relinquishing exactness to better approximate the real problem that we're after can be scientifically satisfying too. It doesn't have to be seen as like the less mathematical or the less rigorous approach. We worked on tetrahedralization in the past, and the leading tetrahedralization software took the input triangle mesh, no matter how messy it was, and tried its hardest to come up with a tetrahedralization that exactly conforms to the triangles that it was given. The problem here is that often it would just fail, and it would just give no output. And it was much more useful to allow our algorithm to remesh the surface of that shape so that we could create a tetrahedralization always and 100% output something. And then once we have something that we output, we can talk about the error or different qualities of that tetrahedralization in a statistically meaningful way and compare that to existing algorithms. So fail versus succeed turned into something measurable that had non-binary quantities. And in this example, succeeding 100% of the time on the approximate problem was more valuable than frequently failing catastrophically in terms of not getting any output on the exact problem. I was looking back at those, the photos from SGP 2010 and procrastinating on making this keynote talk, and I looked at every single paper that was published that year, hoping that I would like see something interesting pop out of those. I saw a few papers that had interesting models that I had never seen before. So there were a handful of papers that had really interesting 3D models that were out of the standard. But almost all of the papers that year were full of bunnies and armadillos and horses. And this was really a testament to the time. There were not that many models. My advisor sent me like an email with models and was like, here are the models. And like, when you're doing your paper, like, do these models. And most of them couldn't be TET-mesh, so we had even fewer examples. Now, in 2024, every result in your paper can be a different model. That's so wonderful. You can go on stock websites, Thingy 10K, or TurboSquid, and you can get a different model that makes the most sense for the thing that you're trying to show in your geometry processing research. You can get so many models that you can talk scientifically and statistically about the empirical success of your algorithm versus a different algorithm. You can find models that represent the messiness of the real world, whether it's interesting high-resolution scans or it's meshes that come from modeling software that don't maintain all the nice things that keep our geometry processing algorithms working on clean data. And that's going to change even more. These new reconstruction methods are going to flood the geometry processing pipeline with really messy, nasty geometric representations, and we should be ready for that. We should also admit when we're not sure of an answer. So if we look at a scanning pipeline that starts with some raw data, creates a point cloud, Poisson surface reconstruction, and creates a mesh, it's foolish to think that this is the surface that we're working with. This is a particular output of a chain of algorithms that tried to make sense of the raw data that we captured. And instead, if we can track error through this process, it can turn into uncertainty in each of the answers along the step, and then this eventually turns into information that we can use either in our downstream applications or for the people that are using our algorithms. One particular example of this is self-driving cars. So if we want our cars to proceed safely in our streets, they need to be able to answer questions like, am I going to run into this thing or person? So if we're representing the geometry of the scene around self-driving cars with point clouds, we need to answer the question like this: does this car intersect with the shape represented by this point cloud? If we run something like Poisson surface reconstruction, we can get a particular surface that explains that point cloud, and then we could answer this question based on that explanation. And in this case, it would say, no, it doesn't intersect with that surface. So proceed, drive there. That's pretty scary because when we're looking at the point cloud, we can see there's lots of different possible explanations for how those points came to be. It could be that one, or it could be something that connects near that car like that, or like that, or like that. And some of these intersect with the car, and some of them don't. And that uncertainty in the output should be represented in the algorithms and the spaces of output functions that we provide. So in the original Poisson surface reconstruction, you get one shape. Recently, my student Sylvia Sayan had generalized this idea of Poisson surface reconstruction to work well with the idea of Gaussian processes so that we don't output just one representation of the implicit function that explains those points, but we get an entire statistical distribution. And briefly how this works is that algorithm outputs a mean of a distribution for each point, which looks very much like Poisson surface reconstruction, but we also output a variance at every point. And if we pick some point like the big red or green dot where the x is, and we draw that mean and variance as a 1D plot here, we see it as a Gaussian. And now we can ask, what is the integral of that Gaussian up to 0. And that corresponds to what is the likelihood that this function is less than 0, our level set of where we're going to decide the surface is. And that's great because that gives us then the probability that that point is inside of the shape. And that's much more meaningful as an output than just outputting the mean or just outputting Poisson surface reconstruction. We can take this idea of uncertainty and also apply it to novel representations. So one problem that's happening with NeRF reconstructions is you see part of the scene only with one of the photographs that you saw. And so for NeRF, the easiest thing to do to explain that blip that you saw is to just put a little bit of density right next to where the camera is and just color that there. Because no other camera saw that, we cannot triangulate where that lies in 3D space, so it just shows up as a floating cloud right in front of the camera. So in that original NeRF view that you saw a lot of these floaters all around. If we can quantify uncertainty, then that gives us a way to post-process the output of these NeRF reconstructions and keep only the reconstruction that we're very certain about. Okay, we're near the end of my talk. I found this interesting quote from Michael Black that resonated a lot with me right now in terms of how I'm thinking about the field of geometry processing and these new representations. He said, after AlexNet took first place in ImageNet Challenge, everybody of a certain age went through 5 stages of grief. So there was denial, and there was bargaining. Well, what if we use triangle mesh for this and not that? And eventually, we overcame this in the computer vision field. I think we're already steps ahead of this in geometry processing. One thing that's frustrating is that we really care about geometry applications, and we don't see them as a community, as SGP, we don't see them just as tasks for machine learning to apply their algorithms on one day and then move on to some other task the next day. So it's kind of bittersweet to see machine learning advances make big, bold, messy progress on a problem that we care so deeply about, things like procedural modeling or reconstruction or even simulation. But in the end, the diversity of these representations in 3D are an opportunity for us. They allow us to tackle bigger portions of the geometry processing pipeline end to end. They're opening up bigger output spaces for our algorithms, including exciting things like uncertainty. And I think they'll have a much bigger impact on people and all the people in the world. And that includes the professionals who care just as deeply about our applications as we do. And many of those professionals are outside of the world of computer graphics and entertainment, where our triangle meshes had their origins. And it also eventually includes everyone on Earth, because it's changing the way that we do commerce, creation, and communication. And with that, I would like to thank my collaborators, especially the students that have worked on the projects that I showed, and the authors of all the works that I referenced in this talk and my funding agencies. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Alec, for the great talk. So do we have questions in the audience? Yes, right there. I have one of the mic, maybe. Yeah.
Hey, great talk. It really resonates with me.
Thank you.
The uncertain surface reconstruction was sort of motivated by saying, well, the output is just, one possible output of an algorithm, but then also the Poisson surface reconstruction is also an output of an algorithm, and you have to sort of assume priors, and the distributions are pointwise and not over surfaces. So how do you think about that, and like what do you think that is the right formulation? Do you think we need a different uncertain formulation? Do you think we should just be solving problems like on the original point cloud data?
That's a great question. I guess this is there's a larger version of this question that ties in Bayesian statistics as a whole, or causality models, where At the end of the day, you can provide an answer to a game that you set up as the researcher or the scientist, but there's no way for the system to necessarily tell you that you set up the wrong game. So I think we're currently in a state where we're using lots of algorithms without questioning their uncertainty. And so we have a great opportunity now to apply the view of uncertainty to the existing pipeline without really even changing anything and start asking a question of, are we actually happy with the output that we have? I think you're asking about something much more important that I hope that we can eventually get to, which is, can we find ways of evaluating different choices of how did we even decide what to do with that raw point cloud? Like, why was Poisson surface reconstruction even a reasonable prior to apply in the first place? In that paper, the initial paper that Sylvia and I wrote, there's a couple examples of showing different priors that we can apply. And that's great because then we can hand someone an opportunity to say like, okay, well, what if I have a different prior, not just like a smoothness prior? We have some, I think we have an example where we have like a sphere prior, so we know that the shape is roughly spherical. And we do indeed get a different answer. So now it's like our algorithm is outputting two different things, so how do we deal with that? So I read a little bit about causality models, and they have kind of a similar problem where you can set up a causal diagram and you can evaluate whether your evidence supports that causal diagram, but there's nothing that tells you that you just like wrote down the completely wrong diagram. And as far as I know, that's like open research in the question of statistics. So that would be really interesting to apply here as well. But as far as I know, it's like pretty open.
Hi. At the end of the day, the representation you want is whatever the hardware can render efficiently. So if you had any advice for hardware manufacturers, what would you tell them to be working on?
Okay, so you know, like not all applications require rendering in the end, right? Like some applications, the eventual thing that you want to do is make a decision about like building a bridge or like deciding what your living room looks like. And visualization is one part of the like much larger pipeline along the way. But it is like a really essential part of that pipeline. And we've structured a lot of geometry processing on around the human visual system and rendering. I don't know that I'm qualified to say like what hardware should look like. I definitely think people are investing in volumetric rendering, and I think that's a really, really good idea. Because a lot of the representations are volumetric and don't rely on rasterization. So I think that's really exciting, and I'm excited to see volume rendering or being able to directly render implicits become kind of a commodity rather than something that every grad student needs to cook up to test their algorithms. So he asked, what representation is needed for the Altair car crash that we saw yesterday? I mean, I guess Eamon from Altair should answer that rather than me. It sounded like, based on his talk, that they are trying to get a representation that feeds into a finite element simulation. So it seems like they're using some form of volumetric surface and 1D meshes for their existing pipeline. So like, to me, that falls under like, practitioners today want triangle meshes now. Like, for sure, if we want to support that application directly, triangle mesh research and volume mesh research, that's all going to be immediately useful. My point is about short-term versus long-term, and we shouldn't only look at those short-term problems. It's very, very good to look at those short-term problems, but I think there's also really interesting long-term problems where you say, like, let's forget about their pipeline. Their pipeline exists for a bunch of different reasons, including, like, who's the boss at that company and what they did last year and like who did or didn't maintain different pieces of their code base. Like those aren't necessarily important scientific reasons to keep doing things the way that we're doing it. I see. So the question is, like, could I imagine using nerfs or signed distance fields or implicits in an application like Altair's car crash? I can imagine all sorts of things. My imagination is ridiculous. Like, definitely I can imagine that. Like, probably you're asking, like, how soon do we get to that point? Or is that, like, a good future to imagine? I think probably, because I love the idea of being able to take like the clay model of whatever card that they've been designing, directly scan it, and have that be a automatic, continuously parameterized pipeline that goes all the way through simulation, and then can provide feedback on that thing that they made. And right now, it's just like so many steps along the way that like that process is really, really not easy to backprop all the way through. So I think there's gold at the end of setting up that pipeline. I think it's really painful because anyone who wants to set up that specific entire pipeline is going to realize how many intricate details went into the specific way that they're doing it. And they weren't frivolous decisions. They were decisions made based on the specific things that they care about and care about a lot. So I definitely don't think it's easy, but like, sure, like, I'll dream about it tonight.
Great talk. Thanks for the talk. So my question is like regarding like surface level sets. Like, has there been similar work for like on the surface level sets, like SDF? No.
Okay. Yeah, I think I should have done a better job talking about how important I think that is. Because I think I was trying to allude to that by talking about doing computation on surfaces. So that's a lot of what we do in geometry processing is we have an existing geometry as, let's say, a triangle mesh. And then we want to do some computation like messing with scalar fields or vector fields on the surface. And this example of intrinsic triangulations that I gave is, I think, like a wonderful point in our literature where we use a different function space to represent those scalar fields and vector fields on the surface. I think it is really interesting to say, like, if my geometry is represented by something like Gaussian splats or nerfs or SDF, how then do I do scalar field and vector field processing on that level set in an interesting way? There are like papers that are just like using the same representation, the neural network representation or whatever, to represent those scalar fields. Like Gaussian splats and nerf are doing that because they output not just the function that you're taking the level set of, but also reflectance, which you can see as a field living on the surface of the shape. They're wasting, maybe not wasting is the right way to put it, but like they're also defining that value off of the surface, which, you know, it's weird. Like you can ask, what is the reflectance of a point that has no density? And it might tell you something interesting, but then what do you do with that? It's debatable whether or not that's a waste, because maybe the fact that it can do weird things away from the surface allows it to do better things on the surface. So I think that's a really rich and interesting problem to look at.
Excellent, thank you very much. So I think Alec will be around.
I will. Yeah.
Feel free to ask questions afterwards.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.